Welcome to this deep dive. We are going to be exploring something pretty fascinating, panpsychism.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
You know, the idea that mind or consciousness isn't just this thing unique to us humans, but it's like a fundamental part of reality, you know?
Hmm.
And we've got excerpts here from David Skrbina's book, Panpsychism in the West.
Okay.
And we're going to take a journey through philosophical history to see how this idea has been considered, debated, defended
Well,
over the centuries.
a long journey from ancient Greece to the modern day. All these thinkers from different times, different backgrounds, wrestling with this mind-boggling concept. It's really something.
So let's start with those ancient Greeks,
Yeah,
shall we?
let's do it.
Skrbina, he starts with the pre-Socratics, those philosophers who came before Socrates.
Right.
And one of the first figures we encounter is Thales, who had this idea that all things are full of gods.
Mm.
What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, at first glance, it sounds a little strange.
A little out there, right?
Right.
But I think if we sort of look closer, what we see is a worldview that's very different from our own.
Okay.
You know, for Thales and these pre-Socratics, the distinction between mind and matter, it wasn't so clear-cut as it is for us. You know, they saw psyche, which we usually translate as soul or mind, as something kind of intertwined with the very life force of the universe.
So it's not that they literally believed in, like, tiny gods
Yeah.
inhabiting rocks and trees and everything.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's more about recognizing a kind of divine power or animating principle within all things.
Okay.
Yeah, and we see this with other pre-Socratics too, like Anaximenes, for example. You know, he argued that air being present everywhere, right? Like it's all around us.
Yeah.
And being the source of, you know, our own soul or mind. Well, that could mean that a similar manifestation might exist in all things.
So if the air we breathe, something seemingly so, basic and simple.
Could have this kind of mind-like quality. Why not everything else?
Precisely. Yeah, and Anaximenes is introducing this principle of continuity.
Oh.
There's a connection between the air we breathe, the soul within us, and the possibility that a similar principle, extends throughout the cosmos.
That brings us to Plato, one of the most influential figures in Western philosophy. And Skrbina points out that Plato's famous tripartite theory of soul, right?
Yeah.
Reason, spirit, and appetite. This wasn't just meant for humans.
Right, exactly. Plato saw these three components as potentially present in all living things, what he called zoa. And in fact, in his work, Laws, he even goes so far as to suggest that stars, the seasons, even natural processes might possess souls.
Whoa, so we're not just talking about like plants and animals having souls,
Right.
but potentially the entire cosmos.
Yeah, the whole shebang.
That's a pretty radical idea,
Okay.
even today.
It is. Now, whether Plato, can definitively be classified as a full-fledged panpsychist, that's a matter of debate. I mean, he clearly endorses this world soul concept,
Right.
this idea that the cosmos as a whole has a soul. But how far down the chain of being that soul stuff goes, that's a little bit less clear.
Yeah, it's still a pretty wild thought to consider. You know, stars and planets potentially having souls.
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes you wonder about our place in the universe.
Absolutely. It definitely challenges that sort of, human-centered perspective that we tend to have,
Yeah.
and invites us to consider a much more expansive view of mind and consciousness.
For sure. So we've talked about Thales and Anaximenes and Plato. What about Aristotle?
Right.
He's another giant in the history of philosophy.
Oh, Aristotle. He's fascinating, because he brings this concept of pneuma to the table, this life-giving heat that's present in all things. And there's this quote from his work, Generation of Animals, that's really striking. He says, all things are full of soul.
Okay, hold on. All things are full of soul.
That's what he says.
That sounds pretty explicitly panpsychist, doesn't it?
It does. Now, Aristotle's panpsychism does differ from Plato's in some important ways.
Okay.
While Plato is focused on the world of forms, the transcendent Aristotle grounds his view in the material world and the role of this vital heat, pneuma.
So for Aristotle, it's this, pneuma, that animates and connects all things, giving them a kind of soul or life force.
Exactly. And this idea of pneuma as a unifying principle was developed further by the Stoics, who saw it as this force connecting everything in the universe, making it one big, living, rational being.
Whoa, so we've gone from the Greeks seeing mind and everything,
Hmm.
to the Stoics picturing the entire universe as this
Yeah.
intelligent entity. That's quite a leap.
It is. And Skrbina suggests that this ancient Greek idea of pneuma, this life-giving force connecting all things, actually had a surprising influence on later Western thought.
Now that's intriguing. You're going to have to tell me more about that. But first, let's talk about how panpsychism fared after the ancient Greeks.
Well, as Christianity became kind of the dominant worldview in Europe, panpsychism, it sort of went underground for a while.
Right. Yeah.
The focus shifted to the human soul as something unique and separate from the rest of creation, which, didn't leave much room for this idea of mind being present in all things.
Right. It's like the idea of a universal mind or soul
Hmm.
got sidelined for a few centuries there.
Yeah, pretty much.
But then, Skrbina tells us, things start to change during the Renaissance. What happened?
Yeah. So the Renaissance, it saw a revival of interest in classical learning, including the works of Plato and Aristotle, and coupled with these new scientific discoveries that were challenging the prevailing Aristotelian worldview.
Uh-huh.
Well, it created fertile ground for panpsychist ideas to reemerge.
So it's like a perfect storm of rediscovering ancient wisdom
Yeah.
and making groundbreaking scientific observations.
Right, exactly.
What kind of thinkers embraced panpsychism during this period?
Well, one fascinating figure is Giordano Bruno,
Okay.
a true Renaissance man who embraced the idea of an infinite universe. And he saw this vastness as evidence for the presence of mind in all things.
An infinite universe filled with infinite mind.
Yeah.
That's a pretty mind-blowing concept.
Yeah, it is. And then we have William Gilbert, a pioneer of experimental science who made a rather unexpected argument for panpsychism.
Okay.
He was fascinated by magnetism and saw it as a force that demonstrated a kind of intelligence or animacy in inanimate objects.
So he's finding evidence for mind in the forces of nature themselves.
Yeah, this led him to speculate that even planets and stars might possess a kind of soul or animating principle. He saw magnetism as this kind of bridge between the material and the mental.
It's like these Renaissance thinkers were looking for mind everywhere, trying to understand how it fit into this new picture of the universe that was emerging.
Yeah, totally. Another figure from this period, Tommaso Campanella, he claimed that wisdom was the fundamental principle of reality, and he believed that this implied a universal sentience, a kind of intelligence woven into the very fabric of existence.
So we see a resurgence of panpsychism during the Renaissance. But it's not just a rehashing of ancient ideas. These thinkers are incorporating new scientific discoveries into their views.
Yeah, for sure. It's this really dynamic period where the old and the new are coming together, leading to, a reimagining of panpsychism for a new era.
That takes us to the 19th century, where we encounter some really big names in philosophy who grappled with panpsychism in their own ways. Skrbina starts with Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism. What was his take on all this?
Yeah, Schopenhauer. Well, he's interesting because he connects panpsychism to his view of the world as driven by this blind, striving force. He calls it will. And he sees this will as manifested in all things, from the simplest organisms to the most complex.
So instead of a mind or a soul, we have this universal will driving everything.
Precisely. And for Schopenhauer, this will is the source of both our suffering and our creativity. It's this, relentless force that pushes us forward, but also causes us pain.
So it's a pretty bleak view,
Yeah.
but also strangely compelling. What about other thinkers from this period?
Well, we have Gustav Fechner, a German psychologist and philosopher who had this fascinating idea of a hierarchy of consciousness, extending from atoms all the way up to the Earth itself.
A hierarchy of consciousness. That sounds a bit like those levels of being we discussed earlier with Plato.
Yeah, there are definitely echoes of that ancient idea there. But Fechner's view is more systematic and hierarchical. He envisioned this grand scale of consciousness with simple minds at the lower levels, combining to form more complex minds as we move up the ladder.
So even rocks and planets would have some level of consciousness, just, much simpler than ours.
Exactly. And Fechner, being a scientist as well as a philosopher, he was trying to integrate panpsychism with this emerging scientific worldview of the 19th century.
And Skrbina mentions that even William James, the father of American psychology, explored panpsychism in his later works. What was his view?
Well, James, he was intrigued by panpsychism. He saw it as a potential solution to the mind-body problem. He struggled with this question of how our mental experiences relate to our physical bodies. And panpsychism offered a way to see mind and matter as interconnected aspects of reality.
So we see these 19th century thinkers grappling with panpsychism, trying to fit it into this evolving understanding of the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we move into the 20th century, panpsychism continues to, evolve and adapt, drawing inspiration from fields like psychology, biology, and even physics.
Skrbina talks about this period in the early 20th century where panpsychism seems to be popping up all over the place. From Russia to England to America, it's like the idea is having a bit of a renaissance.
It is. It's a time of tremendous intellectual ferment, with new ideas and movements challenging those traditional ways of thinking. And panpsychism, with its radical challenge to materialism, well, finds a receptive audience among certain thinkers.
Tell me about some of these thinkers. Who were they and what were their arguments?
Well, one figure Skrbina highlights is Samuel Alexander, a British philosopher who saw mind as representing the connection between levels in this grand hierarchy of existence.
A hierarchy of existence. We're back to that idea again. It's really fascinating how this concept keeps recurring throughout the history of panpsychism.
I know, right? And Alexander's view, it's connected to his idea of emergent evolution. He sees the universe as unfolding in stages, with each stage giving rise to, new qualities and levels of complexity, including mind.
So for Alexander, mind isn't something separate from the material world. It's an emergent property that arises from the increasing complexity of the universe.
Exactly. And it's not just about mind emerging. It's about the interconnectedness of different levels of reality. He suggests that each level of reality actually serves as the mind for the levels below it.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, for Alexander, time is the mind of space, life is the mind of matter, and we humans are the mind of life.
You got it. It's a pretty heady concept.
It certainly is. And it seems like Alexander wasn't the only one exploring these kinds of ideas. Skrbina mentions another philosopher from this period, Nikolai Losky, who developed this concept of substantival agents. What are those?
Yeah. Losky's panpsychism is more personalistic. He sees the fundamental building blocks of reality as agents, or mini-persons, each with its own degree of agency and experience.
Wait, mini-persons all the way down. That's a whole other level of mind-bending. So instead of just minds or consciousness, he's talking about tiny little persons inhabiting everything from atoms to planets.
In a way, yeah. It challenges our assumptions about what constitutes a person. But for Losky, it's a way of understanding that fundamental creativity and agency that he sees as inherent in the universe.
Okay, I'm going to need a minute to process that one. But before we do, can we talk about a few other folks Skrbina mentions who were at least flirting with panpsychism?
Of course. There's Leonard Troland, an American psychologist who actually tried to map out the psychic atoms that would make up the mental world.
Psychic atoms.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's trying to give panpsychism a scientific grounding.
He was. Troland's panpsychism was very scientifically oriented, and he attempted to, integrate it with the emerging science of psychology, proposing this model of mind based on these elementary psychic particles.
So he's trying to take this ancient philosophical idea and give it a modern scientific twist.
Exactly. And then there's John Dewey, a prominent figure in American pragmatism who, while not like a full-blown panpsychist, definitely leaned in that direction. He saw mind as a function of organisms interacting with their environment.
So for Dewey, mind is not something static or pre-existing, but emerges from this dynamic relationship between organisms and their surroundings.
That's right. He emphasized this ongoing process of experience and how mind arises from that process.
It's like we're seeing a gradual shift in the way panpsychism is being conceptualized. It's moving away from this idea of static souls or minds residing in things and toward a more dynamic, process-oriented view.
You're picking up on a key theme here. As science advanced and our understanding of the universe became more complex, so too did the ways in which thinkers approached and articulated panpsychism.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
From ancient Greece to the early 20th century.
Right.
But Skrbina doesn't stop there. He dives headfirst into the more recent and contemporary views on panpsychism.
And this is where it gets really interesting. We encounter thinkers who are grappling with panpsychism in light of, the latest developments in quantum physics, neuroscience, information theory.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's dive into those modern perspectives and see how panpsychism is being reinterpreted for the 21st century. So we're ready to explore these modern perspectives on panpsychism. What are some of the key ideas that emerge in the mid-20th century and beyond?
Well, with the rise of quantum mechanics and relativity, some physicists started to really question that purely materialistic view of the universe.
Okay.
We're struck by the strangeness of the quantum world, where particles seem to exist in this state of potentiality, and the observer plays a role in collapsing the wave function.
It's like the very act of observation is somehow influencing reality at the most fundamental level. Did this lead some physicists to embrace panpsychism?
Some, like Sir James Jeans, were definitely drawn to it,
Okay.
or at least to something very close. Jeans, he was fascinated by the idea that the universe might be more like a great thought than a great machine.
So instead of seeing the universe as just this collection of inert matter governed by, blind physical laws, he's suggesting there might be some kind of mind or consciousness underlying it all.
Yeah, precisely. And it wasn't just physicists who were exploring these ideas. Skrbina talks about Sewell Wright, a biologist who saw potential for panpsychism within the framework of evolution.
That's interesting. How did Wright connect panpsychism to evolution?
Well, he argued that consciousness could have gradually evolved alongside matter, becoming more complex over time. He saw it as a natural outcome of the evolutionary process, a quality that emerged alongside other complex biological features.
So just as, life evolved from non-life, consciousness could have evolved from a more basic rudimentary form of awareness that was present in the early universe.
That's the idea. And then we have Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician and philosopher, who developed his own intricate system of thought called process philosophy, which is deeply steeped in panpsychist ideas.
I've heard of Whitehead, but I must admit I don't know much about his work. What's the connection to panpsychism?
Well, Whitehead's process philosophy sees the universe as this dynamic flow of experience, and he talks about actual occasions.
Okay.
These tiny bits of experience that make up the universe, and each actual occasion has both a mental and a physical pole, meaning that even at the most fundamental level, there's a kind of proto-consciousness at play.
So instead of just inert matter bumping around in the void, we have these tiny bits of experience, these actual occasions, constantly interacting and creating the world as we know it.
That's a good way to put it. And what's fascinating is that Whitehead's ideas, they've resonated with contemporary thinkers who are trying to bridge the gap between science and spirituality, between our understanding of the physical world and our own inner experience.
It's like these modern panpsychists are drawing on both the latest scientific discoveries and ancient wisdom traditions to develop a more holistic view of reality.
Exactly. And Skrbina then brings us to the late 20th century, where we encounter Thomas Nagel, the philosopher known for his essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?
Oh, yeah.
Nagel argues that subjective experience, what it feels like to be a conscious being, can't be fully explained by objective scientific terms.
I remember that essay. It really made me think about the limitations of a purely materialist worldview. How does Nagel's work connect to panpsychism?
Yeah, well, Nagel, he's not explicitly endorsing panpsychism,
Okay.
but he's raising serious questions about the idea that consciousness can simply be reduced to physical processes. He argues that subjective experience is a fundamental aspect of reality, and that any complete account of the universe must take it into account.
So he's opening the door for panpsychism, even if he's not walking through it himself.
That's a good way to put it. And as we move into the 21st century, we see a resurgence of interest in panpsychism among philosophers and even some scientists.
Skrbina spends the last part of the book discussing some of these contemporary thinkers. He talks about Galen Strawson, a philosopher who makes a strong case for panpsychism. What's Strawson's argument?
Well, Strawson argues that the idea of consciousness emerging from non-conscious matter is ultimately incoherent. He claims that the only way to make sense of consciousness is to see it as a fundamental aspect of reality, present in some form in all things.
So for Strawson, panpsychism isn't just a possibility, it's a necessity.
Right.
If we're going to take consciousness seriously, we have to embrace the idea that it's not something that just pops into existence out of nowhere.
Exactly. And his work has been, very influential in contemporary philosophy of mind. Then there's David Chalmers, who's known for his work on the hard problem of consciousness. While Chalmers doesn't fully endorse panpsychism, he's certainly open to it.
The hard problem of consciousness, that's the question, is why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience.
Right. Yes. And Chalmers suggests that panpsychism, by taking consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality, offers a potential solution to this problem.
So instead of trying to explain how consciousness emerges from matter,
Right.
we start with the idea that consciousness is always already there in some form, even at the most basic levels of reality.
Right. And this resonates with what we've seen throughout our exploration of panpsychism, from the ancient Greeks who saw mind in everything, to the modern physicists grappling with the implications of quantum mechanics.
Wow. We've covered so much ground in this deep
I
time.
know, it's amazing.
We've gone from ancient Greece to quantum physics to modern debates about the nature of consciousness. It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and it's a journey that's far from over. The debate over panpsychism is still ongoing, with new arguments and perspectives emerging all the time.
So where does this leave us? What should we take away from this exploration of panpsychism?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that panpsychism offers a radically different way of seeing the world. It challenges us to expand our understanding of mind and consciousness, to recognize the interconnectedness of all things, and to reconsider our place in the universe.
It's a perspective that invites us to see the world with new eyes, to appreciate the mystery and wonder of existence, and to approach the natural world with a sense of reverence and respect.
Beautifully put. And perhaps, as Skrbina suggests, if we truly embrace the idea of a panpsychic universe, it might even change the way we live our lives and interact with the world around us.
Well, that's something to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into panpsychism in the West.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.